Hello, I'm Judy Barr on the board of the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust, and welcome to our second in a three-part series of Flower Power, how native plants can save our bugs and our birds. This tonight, the second one, is designing a native plant garden. Last week, Doug Ptolemy gave us the overview of why native plants are important for the birds and the bees and the pollinators and the butterflies. Well, tonight we're going to have a woman who has received numerous awards in her design of native plant gardens. She's the principal landscape architect at the Rain Garden Design Studio, which she now is the principal of. And she will be presenting on how to properly design so that these native plants that we need so badly are beautifully brought into our yard. In the next slide, I just want to give an overview of what all of the Pollinate Wellesley is about. It's a partnership among the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust, the Wellesley Natural Resources Commission, and the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust. And it's going to be a whole spring summer event. There'll be numerous things rolling out, and this is really the three-part series, the kickoff of it. But there are going to be milkweed plant sales so that you can help the butterflies. This is the speaker series later in the summer when these plants start being in their glory. There's going to be gardening tours, there's a reading list, and there's numerous resources on the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust webpage. You're going to get yard tips next week, but there'll be more in detail. We've already last Saturday had a citizen science project. So there's going to be many more. All of the collateral ones are going to be on the Wellesley Mass government webpage at the NRC link. The next slide is just that, as I said, it's a partnership, three parts of three major movers in the town to help in conservation efforts. The team that put this series together is B. Bezaninoff, Katie Griffith, Raina McNamara. They are all, Raina McManus, they are all members or former members of the NRC. Judy Barr, and then Michael Tobin, who is providing the technological support for this. We're active in Sustainable Wellesley, but we're also on the board of the Land Trust. The next slide shows you, speaking of the Land Trust, where our properties are. We have 10 sanctuaries, there are 5 trails. Several of them are down in the lower southwest corner, Guernsey, as well as the Susan Lee and Hale. And recently we've been doing, helped by the guidance of Cricket Vlass and the webinar she gave to us in January, we're doing invasive removal at Guernsey. There'll be 3 teams working there Saturday morning, and then another team led by Girl Scout Gold Award project, whose name is Claire Eichboom, and she will be leading the effort on removal of invasives in the native wildflower garden there. We are an advocate for natural spaces and protection. We obviously offer educational programs. This is our 7th one since January, and we are funded by membership dues and donations. No taxpayer dollars. We're a private 503c3 land trust. The next slide asks the question, really, what are the issues that got these 3 groups together to say we need to have a Pollinate Wellesley week, or really summer, spring activity. As you know, there's a decline in natural space. There's the growth of development where tracts of land that before had been farmland or undeveloped land have now become large yards with lawns and very few of the native plants that were there, as well as deforestation. And with that lawn and deforestation comes a decline of the native plants. And as Doug Talamay told us last week, it's so important to have native plants that have evolved in synchrony with our birds, our bees, our butterflies, because the birds, bees, butterflies depend upon the food that our native plants produce. And when the birds right now are migrating through this area, and the peak of migration is just happening in a few days, they're going to be looking for the bugs that are in the leaf matter, as well as some of the native plants that come out early. And especially when they migrate south and the butterflies migrate south, they need the native plants that have the pollen, as well as the insects that provide protein for them. So native plants are critical, and native plants survive better when we don't use pesticides, because the pesticides is going to kill the bugs and the other insects. We need to increase the removal of invasives and imported things such as burning bush, garlic mustard, glossy buckthorn. That's what we're starting to do at Guernsey with Riga. And the results of all of those threats, all of the reduction of natural space and fewer native plants and killing off the insects, results in, since 1970, 2/3 of the native wildlife has vanished. Since 2013, in 2013, there were only 3.6% of the butterflies that had, and especially the monarchs, that had been counted in 1976. In the year 2019, there were 2.9 billion fewer birds than existed in 1970 in North America. And in 2019, there were 40% of insects that are declining and actually could die out and become extinct in coming days. So the most threatened of those insects are the ones that the birds primarily rely on to feed their young, moths and larvae, and as well as the pollinators for our native plants. So the next slide says that there are some of the things that Wellesley has already done is, since 2002, we prohibited toxic pesticides on town property. And there's been efforts to try to encourage landowners as well as yard care professionals to decrease the use of toxic pesticides. Wellesley has a program called Grow Green Wellesley. We have green zones within the town where we plant natives as well as pollinator gardens. And we transition to a lighter hand and use less raking, less power blowers. And if blowing is needed, we'll use an electric yard equipment, but only when needed. And tonight we will have designing the garden. So last week was why. This week is how it's happening. And next week will be, once your garden is in, how do you take care of it and take care of your yard so that it will be there next year for the birds and the bees and the insects that need it. This week, Amanda Sloan. She is the principal of the Rain Garden. She is a registered landscape architect. She's also been doing this for 28 years in a wide variety of projects. She works in both public projects as well as private yards, and especially now related to native plants. She serves on the board of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, which is a group of landscape architects and designers that are working to encourage more native plants in landscape design. We have, as I mentioned, one more talk that's going to be coming up. This webinar will last 45 minutes, will be recorded. There'll be a question and answer, and you're all on mute. So please put any questions in chat. And after Amanda, and 1 week from it, remember, In the next slide, you'll be reminded of rethinking yard care. Do less and save more. So tonight, Amanda Sloan, designing a native plant garden, bringing native plants beautifully into your yard. Amanda, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
So I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody hear me? Oh, I just need to.
Yep, we can hear you.
I just need to work this out. Let's see. Okay. And I think that's the one I want to share. So, all right, there we go.
You're good.
Excellent, thank you. Well, welcome everybody. I hope that your evening up in Wellesley is as beautiful as ours is down in Sharon, where I am. It's been just a lovely day. And thank you, Judy, for such a nice introduction. I'm going to get right into some little tricks that you can use to make your native plant garden beautiful. And we're going to talk about why sometimes when you first start in with native plants in your yard, it's not feeling so beautiful. So let me move on with this. Oops. Okay, so the quote that you see there, it's a little bit strong, but I think it's really true. When you're talking about your home landscape, you really want to be surrounded by beauty. And especially if you're making the effort to plant native plants and, create an ecosystem, you really want people to understand why you're doing that and be curious about it and maybe want to do it themselves. And as we all know, if your home landscape doesn't look so great, people are going to be less curious. It probably matters less to the actual animals in the landscape, but we're really trying to pass on the message about native plants. And so it's a wonderful plus, and it's a very easy thing to do to make your native plant garden beautiful. So I know that last week you did sort of get a primer from the big professor of the whole subject, Doug Tallamy, about why we should use native plants. I'll just go over quickly then, probably a sort of a review of what he talked about. So native plants support our pollinators. Here in the Northeast, it's insects and birds. In more tropical, warmer locations, bats are added to that list. And without pollinators, so the insects and the animals that come and sip nectar from a flower, gather pollen, and then visit another flower and complete the process so those flowers can create seeds and make more plants. Without them, we don't have any fruits, vegetables, grains, and flowers. And in fact, farmers all over the world now are being encouraged to plant pollinator supportive plant strips between their fields in order to support the native bees and other insects that will pollinate their vast fields that produce all of the foods that we eat and the orchards and all of that. In addition, native plants create important habitat for wildlife and people. The forests, the fields, the riversides, those are all created by native plants, and hopefully invasive plants are not making too much, are not spreading too much in those landscapes. But it's wonderful to understand the way the native plants interact with each other and with the other wildlife to make that special habitat. Native plants create most of our green spaces to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. We all know it's plants and trees that pull that carbon in and hold it so that our global warming problem is solved. Native plants grow better and more sustainably with few to no inputs of water, fertilizer, and maintenance. So in our gardens, it means we don't have to put in as much work. These are plants that are meant to be here. They're meant to be on our land. And a native plant garden is a really beautiful representation of the place that we're in. So there is a there when you have a native plant garden in your yard. And so many of us designers have started concentrating on native plant gardens, and homeowners have also. And usually if you plant, a number of native plants and flowers and shrubs and trees, you will create a successful habitat. But that issue that I was speaking about at the very beginning, as home gardeners, our goal really is to have a beautiful home, a place where we enjoy being, full of beauty and enjoyment, and that includes our landscapes. And as I said before, it's easier to spread the word, and it's more calming and rewarding for us when we can look out our window and really love what we see out there. Or if our neighbors are driving by our house and instead of saying, "Oh my gosh, that looks really ratty," they might say, "Wow, that is beautiful. And I wonder what kind of plants that family is using." And once you've started with native plants, you do realize that making a native plant garden beautiful can actually be a challenge. This is a view of one that it's a very successful garden as far as supporting the pollinators. But it could use a little, it could be kicked up a notch. So why is that? Why can native plants be difficult at first? Well, here are some reasons why. One is that they are specialists. They haven't been bred at a nursery to be very easy to care for, and we can be much less familiar with how to care for them. If we have a landscaper working on our yard, sometimes landscapers are just not at all familiar yet with how to care for native plants. And this scene at the top here with the grass with crew cuts is sometimes that we see is something that we see all over in the Boston area. This is a very typical way that a landscaper will treat a native grass that's been planted at the end of the summer. But that's not the proper way to care for a grass. First of all, those dry stems need to stay standing all winter long because, as Judy mentioned before, they are the homes of our pollinators and other animals all through the winter. And often they harbor egg masses, even cocoons and chrysalises sometimes will overwinter. And so those stems need to stay standing. And if you don't understand that, you'll cut them down in anticipation of new green shoots coming up in the spring. But you really miss, not only the habitat value, but also the beauty of those lovely dried stems catching the snow and ice all through the winter. And second of all, nurseries are not really producing too many native plants. They're more difficult to propagate. Nurseries haven't quite gotten the gist of it yet. There are some wonderful native plant nurseries that I will be sharing later. But it's just hard to find good natives in a regular nursery. And also, we are all really still driven by the old ideas about desirable garden aesthetics. So this scene of a Victorian bedded out garden in a park where you have masses of low growing beds that are all very cleanly shaped and grass paths that are all cleanly shaped. Well, native plants are less amenable to being planted that way. I'm going to show you, though, some ways that we can try um, to emulate a neater garden design with native plants. And I don't know if Doug Tellamy touched on this at all, but I'll just touch on it quickly. It's a bit of a side issue, but when we are selecting native plants, there are actually a whole bunch of issues that or questions that we need to answer. First is the definition of native. Are you going to choose plants that are native to North America, which means the US and Canada? Only the US? Only the Western US or the Eastern US? Only New England? Only Massachusetts? And there are even people who are very, very intent on only having native plants that are typical of their county or even of their town. And that this is because there are genetic differences between, even if it's the same species, there are genetic differences. So you need to sort of figure out how closely you're going to define native. And so that second phrase there, the local ecotypes, that's really what they call the native plants that are very, very typical of your specific area. And there are seed gathering societies and seed gathering companies actually that will send people out to gather seeds only from your area if you're really interested in only growing plants that are very, very typical to your specific area. And then there's the whole issue of the straight species versus the cultivars. The nursery plants are often what they call cultivars of straight species, meaning that they've been bred and bred and bred for particular characteristics like shape, color, single bloom, double bloom. And so they're still that species, but they have other characteristics. And there's a lot of controversy about whether cultivars of our native plants are legitimate. Many of our standard nurseries are now selling cultivars of straight species. And you can see on the right one example of that. That's the purple coneflower at the top, very attractive to butterflies. It's actually more of a Midwestern native than a New England native, but we grow it very successfully here in New England. Plant propagators have bred that thing nearly out of existence, it seems. You see in the bottom image, those are coneflowers also. But they have been bred, so they have these fluffy poodle tops, and they're very attractive to some people. However, a pollinator cannot find its way around that plant. Even though it's a purple coneflower, it is not accessible to the pollinator for nectar. And so that's kind of a really extreme version of this whole issue of straight species versus cultivar. And then, as I said before, often our regular nurseries that we go to don't have these plants yet. We're still learning how to propagate native plants. Often the seeds will need a period of cold, as if they're out in nature experiencing winter before they'll sprout. And then the next issue, though, is that there is a whole industry of wild gathering of native plants, and sometimes they can be really exterminated from an area if they were not nursery propagated. And so when you go to a nursery and you're looking for native plants, you do want to ask, were these gathered from the wild or were they propagated? And I have certainly encountered many times when things like rhododendron maximum, our native rhododendron, were actually just yanked out of wild forests in North Carolina and brought to a nursery. And then the last issue, something you want to ask whenever you buy plants, is to make sure no pesticides were used, and especially what we've come to know as neonics are very, very bad for pollinators. They're very bad for bees, and unfortunately, the EPA is still allowing those to be used in certain situations. So you do need to ask about those sorts of things. So once we've sort of considered all these issues, we can take the next step, which is the fun step, and think about how we're going to design our garden. So from something kind of wild looking to something that is still looks like nature, but it's beautiful and it stirs our hearts and it touches us in a way that makes us want to make gardens like this. So what are some of the design issues that I've run into? And I've been doing this for a long time, and I have to say that I have now changed my entire plant palette to native plants. So any garden that I'm doing is going to have all native plants in it. I'm just not designing with non-natives anymore. And so some of the issues are that a native plant garden can seem messy to humans, as we've seen in those images earlier. People aren't comfortable with plants that are not bred for a certain nice, neat shape and certain nice color and all that sort of thing. There is, in fact, in the native plants that you find in New England, there is less variety of color. The typical colors here in New England are yellow and purple and white. And we'll talk later about why that is. The smaller and finer texture and scale in the blooms and foliage of our natives here in New England. People ask, how can I bring some trees and shrubs into my landscape, especially if you have a smaller property, a small garden. Using trees and shrubs can sometimes bring up questions. And the most important one is, did you create a habitat that pollinators will use? So these are all some design issues that we're going to look at. The most common design issue, a native plant garden can seem messy. And this is what many of my clients will bring up when we talk about a native plant garden. But but they look so messy. They're kind of raggedy, and can we make it look neater? Well, yes, we can. And sometimes it's important to do that. Why does it seem like native plant gardens can look sort of messy? Well, that's a legitimate comment. Native plants are more likely not to have the super neat growth habit that you find in your plants that have been bred and are sold at a nursery. In fact, many of them are kind of spreaders. Goldenrods are spreaders. Asters are spreaders. This is how they survive in the wild. In New England, many of our native plants that pollinators enjoy have masses of small flowers and leaves. Those small flowers, those little composites, each have a little well of nectar in them, and it's very good for our native bees and butterflies that sort of bumble all over the flower. Native plant gardens are healthier if we plant like the plants grow in nature, which means they should be planted like a meadow. So they should be planted very closely together rather than sort of spaced neatly far apart. And as we were talking about with the grasses, native host plants need to be left unpruned through the winter. So for more than half the year here in New England, you're going to be seeing your gardens looking a little dried up, a little, a little brown, a little tan. And to some people that looks messy. They'd rather see everything all cut down. So we're going to talk later about some solutions to that problem. And we have to remember, messy is a human value. It's nature's way, actually. And, if you look at a meadow or an understory shrubbery in a woods area, those kinds of patterns, those natural patterns, are the most attractive to wildlife. So we want to see if we can somehow imitate that in a way that we can tolerate when we do our native plant garden. So we're going to talk about some solutions for this messiness problem, in quotes. A big one that really works well, just give that, kind of sprawly, frothy, spready garden a nice, neat, crisp edge. And using hardscape is the best way to do that. So if you just bring in some nice field boulders, cluster them at the extents of the garden. You can use paths, you can use fences, wall sections. This garden here is actually a rain garden, and the gravel edge that you see all around it is part of the initial filtration system that takes the stormwater from the sidewalk. It's a concrete sidewalk behind the gravel there. You don't really see it in the picture, but it also makes a nice, neat edge for this native plant garden. And what's nice about having gravel like that, or river, washed river stones, sand, is that butterflies, to breed, they really need the minerals, and you'll see them puddling in mud puddles or sand puddles, and they can also do that on gravel like this. And here's just a shot showing how to do that. How do you place your boulders? Well, you're going to create your shape of the garden, and then have someone bring in a bunch of nice, maybe 3 to 4 foot in dimension boulders, and then you're going to just make sculpture out of those. It doesn't have to be all around the garden, but if you place them at the extents, they start to organize the space. Here's another example, and this is actually another rain garden. It's not a residential one, but it's the Historical Society here is in an old house. And so it's kind of the front yard of this old colonial house. And you can see that we've done paving stones in a very geometric arc. So we're not talking a biomorphic shape here. We're really talking a shape that organizes. And then some boulders to complete that. In the rain garden are all native plants. Behind those boulders, it is an herb garden, so those are not natives. One experiment that we did here is within that half circle, instead of planting grass, we planted sedges, which are native alternatives to lawn grass that people are starting to use now. That was right after they were planted in plugs. And you can see some of them are starting to green up already. And this garden is now several years old, and they just mow that sedge the same way they would mow a lawn. And it's nice and green. It's in the shade a little bit, and sedges particularly do well in the shade. Here's another example. This is a driveway. And, so many people like to see a cobble strip at the end of their driveway at their residence, or maybe along the sides. And it makes a very nice edge for, once again, a lovely, frothy, wild native planting. These, I believe, are all hay-scented fern, Denstedia punctilobula. And they, I can guarantee you by now, have spread and filled up that space, and they're just making a nice fluffy edge at the edge of that cobble. Here's a garden that also is not a residential garden. This is actually a memorial garden in it's in Providence, I believe, Rhode Island, but it shows a situation that, especially if you're in a more urban, if you live in a more urban place, you might have a similar little slice of garden, somewhat like this in your backyard, very sloped. You might have some concrete wall that's kind of hemming it in. And what we did with this garden was we actually used that concrete wall. We brought an artist in. We told her what native plants we were going to use, and look at the beautiful painting that she did on that concrete wall that just adds so much to this garden. It's the kind of thing you can do in your backyard if you want to. You see the boulder cluster. There's a river of washed river stone there. All the other plants are native, I believe. Here's a closer view. We've got smooth hydrangea, the Annabelle hydrangea with the white flowers there. We've got weeping Alaska cedar in the rear. And this is an example where we decided that the definition of a native plant was going to be anything native to North America, because weeping Alaska cedar is native to the Pacific Northwest. But also there are ferns in there. Oh, I do see one that's non-native, and that is right in the center. That's Hakonocloa macra. It's Japanese forest grass. I think we probably added that for color, so that's okay. Here's another residential one. Someone who was putting in a new driveway and wanted a garden to complement it. And when she parks her car, she can walk through this native garden almost as if she's walking through a meadow before she gets to her back door with her groceries or whatever. And you can see how the plants are really kind of wild looking, but the placement of the boulders, it just holds everything in place and organizes the space. So that's a big solution for this messiness problem. Here's another one. I like to call these sentinel plants, and you can actually use a rock or a tall grass or another kind of tall, slender plant, and create some upright rhythm in your native garden. I love to use, and people are going to laugh, but I love to use arborvitae for this if I know that deer are not going to be a problem. Often in a more urban residential garden, deer are much less of a problem. And the variety of arborvitae that I love is emerald. It achieves this beautiful spire-like top. It stays nice and slender, and they really look like guardians of the garden. Here's another example of that, and that's with poplar trees. But you can see how those tall, slender accents really define the space. I think that those big purple shrubs are barberry, a big no-no, but there are plenty of other ones that could be used, native ones that would have created the same impression. And I just made this quick little design study showing how just adding some of these tall uprights can really start to organize your space. So here is a photoshopped native plant garden. It's kind of messy looking. And now we're going to add some clusters of a tall, slender evergreen. If you have a problem with deer, you could use junipers instead. Deer will not eat junipers, and there are some that look very like this at the nursery. You can see already we're starting to feel a little more as if this is an organized space that we like to look at. And then the last thing I added was just some boulder clusters. And this one in the front is actually a bird bath. And now this makes a wonderful habitat, but it's something that we feel we can look at and comprehend and enjoy. And here are just some examples of other things you can use for these tall, slender sentinels. Different grasses. On the left, you see a panicum. And on the right, I think that's a Wichita blue juniper, juniper more native to Colorado. And on the right, it's sort of it's kind of an Irish look. I think it's a tall, slender standing stone. And this is at the Massachusetts Horticultural Society Children's Garden, right where you are in Wellesley. I worked with Julie Meservey to help design that garden. And one of the things we did was put in cattails. And gosh, I don't think I've seen cattails growing in any other garden but this, but they make a wonderful tall statement. Behind that smooth hydrangea, the native smooth hydrangea, there are a few colorful non-native perennials down at the bottom there. But there's no reason not to use cattail in your garden. They are wonderful seed sources for goldfinches, red-winged blackbirds, a lot of different birds. Another solution is to just pick a wonderful garden object. Maybe you have something that you love, or your client has something that you love that you really like to see in your garden. This, once again, is at the Children's Garden at Mass Hort, and it's a butterfly bench with a little table in front of it. I think this was ordered from a place called Romancing the, I'm forgetting the whole name of the place, but he makes this unique garden furniture out of dead branches that he finds in the woods. He's in upstate New York, and I think it's Romancing the Woods is the name of his company. But it, as a central focus, all of a sudden, this doesn't look like a messy garden anymore. That's all coreopsis around the bench there. Or a sculpture, or a pot, or a trellis, a garden gate. You can even find something that is already located in your landscape. This residential garden is in Maine, right on the coast. And of course, there's all this beautiful ledge there. So, and when you expose it, it's very sculptural looking. And so we just created this native garden of ferns, and there's some geranium there. There's, a cultivar of blue spruce on the right. Various other things. And just planted it around the ledge. And it's wild looking, but it's somehow the space is organized and it feels really nice to look at and walk around. Another solution is to take one plant that you know will work well in the spot that you have and just plant a lot of it. This is all mayapple. Now, mayapple it's a native New England forest plant. It does have summer dormancy, but it comes up, it's actually up right now and blooming, and the fruits are actually eaten by turtles and a whole bunch of other things. And once that dies down, under it, I've got partridgeberry and wintergreen and some other very low growing native evergreen plants. So it's two different layers of plant massing that really just, it doesn't look messy. Everything's sort of multiples of the same shape there. Here's another example of that. This is all hay-scented fern planted as a foundation planting. It really fills the space, and once it dies down in the fall, there are other native evergreens there that punctuate the space so that it doesn't look boring. There's an inkberry holly, and there's some winterberry in there. There's a bunch of other evergreen ferns like Christmas fern. Marginal wood fern is another evergreen fern. So it's an alive landscape, but all through the summer, it's this mass of ferns that just make it look cohesive. And then this is what we were talking about before, a solution when you're trying to explain to your client that, no, you can't cut those grasses down. You really need to leave everything up because this is winter habitat for a lot of our pollinators. One thing you can do is just, take a nice piece of twine or a nice piece of grass and just gather those stems together into sort of sheaves. It almost looks like corn cobs standing in the fall or at Halloween time, and just leave those up all winter long. So what we were talking about before about less variety of color in the blooms and foliage of natives. You see this image, it's a very typical New England meadow, and yeah, it's yellow, white, and purple. Why? Well, first we have to realize that pollinators, especially bees, their vision is very different and they see very different things in flowers than we do. Often flowers that have nectar will have what they call a nectar guide around the central point, and we can't see it. It's not a wavelength that we can see, but the bees can see it. So they're not really interested in the yellow or the purple. They're looking out for that nectar guide. Bees can't see red, so they can see orange, they can see purple, so they can see reddish colors, they can see pink. But if we want some red in our garden, we're going to have to understand that we're going to be looking for plants that pollinators other than bees are attracted to. And if we're looking for native plants at the nursery, we might find cultivars like that coneflower we saw before that have been bred to a color extreme, often at an extreme form, and these are often very weak plants. Those coneflowers I can't get to last more than a year or two here in New England. And you need to think about your caterpillars. A lot of butterfly caterpillars will, they need our trees like spicebush and our shrubs in order to eat and turn into not chrysalises chrysalises for butterfly caterpillars, but cocoons. And they need camouflage. And that's why most leaf color is green, and the caterpillars that will try to camouflage on it have a lot of green in them. In some cases now, you find that native plants have been bred for red leaf color or for a variegated leaf color instead of green, because that's thought of as more exciting in the garden, and plant propagators feel that that would be very attractive for people at the nursery who are looking to buy plants. But you need to think about, if you buy a red leaf, say a 9 bark that's been bred for this red leaf color, which is really gorgeous, but the caterpillars that are eating the 9 bark can't camouflage on that, and the red pigment has anthocyanins in it, which are actually, caterpillars reject those, and in some cases they can be poisonous. So it's once again an example of really thinking about whether you're going to buy a really cool looking cultivar or a species plant. So if you really do want some red in your garden, you know you can attract birds, hummingbirds, Baltimore Orioles. So you can seek out native plants with these colors. That's scarlet bee balm. And there's a wonderful hibiscus. It's a more southern plant, a swamp hibiscus that's red. You see scarlet lobelia there, cardinal flower it's called, and some more of the bee balm. So if you want red in your native plant garden, just make that decision. I'm going to plant it for the birds, and these are the plants I'm going to choose. You can add orange. On the top left there is a little rain garden we did in the inner city at a residence, and you can see those two little girls. They were so interested, they wanted to water it. We used a lot of yarrow in that garden and rudbeckias. And we did put in some daylilies, which are not native, but you can see there's the red yarrow, I think that's paprika, and there's some yellow yarrow. Butterfly weed, a form of milkweed on the right, is a wonderful orange plant. Planted in a mass. It's stunning. And the lower image there is Gaillardia blanket flower, which is also more of a Western native plant, but it has a lot of good sort of orangey red impact. You can think about choosing plants that will turn red in our New England fall. You know, we're famous for that here. And I think this is a Fothergilla, which will turn this absolutely gorgeous orangey red color. And behind it are inkberries, another native holly. What a great combination. It brings a lot of color to your native plant garden. You can decide that you're gonna, the color that you love most in the garden, you're gonna plant only that color. So this garden is all pink with some white, and then there are some touches of blue. But I don't know how many people realize that garden phlox is a Native American plant. I was thrilled to learn that. And so there's a lot of wonderful phlox here. There's Joe Pye weed, that tall architectural looking kind of dusty pink at the rear. There's Clethra, the creamy white one in the front. There is some Rosa virginiana and caroliniana in there, our native rose. And then there are a few non-native things, but you can see how the pink and the white, it just blends together and it creates this mass of one color that really starts to organize the garden, rather than attempting to just choose a bunch of native plants and then they all turn out yellow, purple, and white. Once again, use your garden ornaments, your benches, your arbors, your sculpture to introduce a color that you'd really like to see in your garden that you just can't find in a native plant. I love this image. The one thing I did want to point out is that those of you knowledgeable about plants will realize that that grass is a miscanthus. And miscanthus is a no-no if you are planting a native plant garden. It's a Japanese species. It's very beautiful. Many of the varieties have been found to be invasive, and there are so many native grasses that you can use instead that will, really give the same impression and will feed our birds. So don't use miscanthus. And once again, not a solution. Your super flashy cultivar that really just a pollinator can't navigate. So try to resist putting those in your garden if you can. And we will touch lightly on some solutions to the fact that many of our New England native plants have a very fine texture, small leaves, small composite flowers like this seaside goldenrod in the center, the bearberry on the right. The reason for this really has to do with where we are, our climate and our latitude. We have a very short summer compared with many other places, and plants need to conserve. They can't sort of go all out making gigantic leaves and gigantic fruits in the small, 4 months of really hot summer that we have. The picture on the right is sort of a contrast. That is a forest in Oregon. And if you go out to Oregon, you'll notice that the trees are twice as big as they are in New England. And the reason is because Oregon is, it's actually a temperate rainforest. It's Pacific Northwest, and they have wonderful temperate weather all year round. And so the plants just can live all year, can grow all year there. But that's not New England. So all you really need to do is just research plants a little bit and, try to vary your scale and your mass and your texture. Look into the ferns, the grasses, the trees, especially evergreens will really mark and give a rhythm to the landscape in the wintertime, and different shapes of leaves. This is geranium with some ferns. Now, I think that is actually big root geranium, which is not a native, but you could use our native cranesbill in exactly the same way there, and it would create the same kind of impression. Once again, varying, a wonderful combination in planting is an evergreen with a grass. There you see panicum. I think this image was used earlier, also the panicum with the juniper, and down below you see something else with a spruce. On the right, rhododendron and ferns. What wonderful textures. And to add scale, there are a whole bunch of native shrubs and plants that actually have outsized leaves and blooms that you can put into your garden. Of course, our native rhododendron maximum, those leaves are positively tropical looking, and the blooms too. And on the right, you see our native swamp mallow. What a spectacular, huge pink flower. And you can grow this in your gardens. It doesn't have to be a swamp. It should be moist, but once the plant gets established, it'll come up. On the left, milkweed, our common milkweed. I grow this in all my gardens. The blossoms smell so sweet as honey, and it just permeates the yard. And the leaves, once again, there's this sort of big tropical, big chunky stem. It's great to have this in your garden. And as we all know, the monarch butterflies, the milkweeds are the only plants they can use to procreate. So it's very important. And on the right, you see, once again, the Joe Pye weed, very tall, statuesque. Oak leaf hydrangea, that's another one that to me looks tropical. And that there it is there, just adding, a whole different texture and feeling to a New England native garden. And using trees and shrubs, as I said, if your garden is small, you might be wondering, how can I use trees and shrubs? They're very important for producing fruit and seeds for birds, and for nesting spots for birds, and for many of our caterpillars, which specialize specifically on particular New England trees and shrubs, like spicebush swallowtail. There are a whole bunch of others. So, once again, I'm just touching on why is this a problem? that they're bigger usually, and they can seem out of scale. They are harder to plant. You will often need a landscape professional to help you plant them, and they're more expensive, most certainly. What's nice about a nice sort of side story to the cultivar thing is that especially many of our native shrubs have been successfully bred now. Varieties have been bred just to be more compact. All of the other characteristics, the flowers, the leaves, are the same as the species, but the plant itself is just more compact. So on the left there, you see clethra, hummingbird. There are a whole bunch. There's 16 candles. There's a whole bunch of varieties of clethra that it's okay to get for your garden because they're more compact and they really support pollinators, and you can fit them in your garden. The middle sort of ground cover looking shrub there is actually a ground cover aronia, a black chokeberry. The flowers are the same, the fruits are the same as the small tree that we all know, but that will fit in a small garden and will support your pollinators. And there are a bunch of others there that you can see too. That are actually on the plant list that will be available on the website after this talk. And you can maybe just cut back on the number of trees you're going to buy or shrubs, but make sure you've got a couple of evergreens in there, and then just get your trees and shrubs in, and then just underplant with ground huggers, or forest understory plants like ferns, like that's bugbane or cohosh there in the front, with these taller, and I think there's some aruncus on the left, some goat's beard, and rather than worrying about all these fancy perennials, you can make a beautiful native garden with just some trees, some few trees, and some good ground covers. And so, as we were saying at the beginning, really the most important issue, and I do consider it a design issue because it is a matter of what you've selected, what plants you've selected. Did you create a habitat that pollinators will use? And these here are, this is Rosa virginiana in my garden. It's our native rose. Look how beautiful that is. And people will come by and they'll say, oh, is that a single form of Rosa rugosa? But I always explain, no, this is a native rose. And Rosa caroliniana and the swamp rose also are native. And these are just buzzing with our tiny native bees all summer long. Wonderful pollinators for all sorts of plants that get well supported by these. And some of the things you need to sort of just catch yourself on in this, did I really create a habitat? We do have a habit in this country of using a lot of mulch and placing our plants far apart. I think it's because there's a sense that it creates a neater look. Mulch can be a very important thing in a garden at first to insulate the soil and make sure that the soil doesn't dry out, and sometimes even adding some nutrients to the soil. But particularly in commercial landscapes, you see this kind of planting. And if you have a landscaper coming in to do your yard, there's a really good chance they're going to do it this way also, because it seems neater to them. This is not a habitat. And other things on the list are things we've touched on before. Just be careful about cultivars. Be sure that they really do support the pollinators that you're looking to support. And the last one is often a surprise to people because there are so many seed mixes and even plant mixes out there that are marketed as butterfly gardens that include butterfly bush. And butterfly bush, unfortunately, is not a good plant to have in your garden. It's not a native. A colleague of mine described it as crack cocaine for butterflies because the nectar is so attractive to butterflies that they will go to that plant rather than the milkweeds or other plants that they really need to lay their eggs on. And if butterflies are laying their eggs on butterfly bush, those eggs are, when the caterpillars come out, they're going to die because they can't eat the leaves. So often my clients will ask for butterfly bush, and I have to tell them, sadly, that that really is not a good plant to have. And there are a bunch of others like that. You know, you'll go to a nursery and there'll be so many butterfly bushes. So it's important to get educated about these things. So, you know, to combat the mulch problem, plant as if you're trying to plant a meadow. You may have your neighbor across the street who has a perfect lawn come by and go, planted too close together. No, you can't plant too close together. The plants will battle it out, and the strongest ones will really survive, and it'll be a beautiful garden. This garden never needs weeding because the plants are so close together that they shade the soil below, and it comes up beautifully like this every summer. Try to go with a species, not a cultivar. So the Latin name is going to have just two words in it, and not something afterwards with quotes that sounds really cute, like Monarda bubblegum or something like that. It's just going to be Monarda didyma, which is bee balm when you're buying your plants. And here's the last word I want to leave you with, which is see if you can try to stick, if you're not going to do all natives in your garden, see if you can just plant about 50% natives in your gardens. And you'll be doing a whole lot to help our pollinators survive, to beautify the earth, to combat global warming, and bring joy to the hearts of everyone who's driving past or walking past your garden. And that big red X on the top left, try not to use butterfly bush if possible. That's the end. And you can see two links there. The first one is where you'll be able to find a whole bunch of recommended plant lists that I have. And I think Michael is going to set that up. If you have any questions about ecological landscapes, do go to the Ecological Landscape Alliance website, which is the bottom one there. There are webinars, there's newsletter articles. If you become a member, everything is free. And it's just a gold mine of information about all of this stuff. So I wrap it up there, and I'm not sure if I went way over time, but I'll be willing to take any questions. And I'll share now.
Yeah, Amanda, that was fantastic and so beautiful to watch. Look at, yeah, I want that one. I want that one in my yard. Thank you so much. There are a lot of questions, so let's get to them. And I've pasted links into these chats already, and we'll email them out and get them to folks. Let's get to it. What are good native options for creating privacy alongside or climbing on an ornamental aluminum pool fence, for instance?
Well, so you would like something tall and slender, and so you could go with, if you're looking for privacy, you probably want some kind of a tall, slender shrub, a shrub or a small tree. If it's inside the pool fence, then you probably won't have a problem with deer unless they're jumping in, which probably they aren't. So some of the different arborvitaes, the thuya, I really like, I know, 25, 30 years ago, everyone said that they hated arborvitae and they'd never put it in their garden. And I was the same, but they've really refined some of the shapes and sizes and colors of arborvitae now. And it is a native plant. You can use tall, slender junipers. If you want to go to perennials, there are a lot of sunflower-like perennials, not the big, huge field sunflowers that you see, but a bunch of different cone flowers. You can use native grasses, a collection of different colors of native grasses. If it's if it's chain link aluminum, that's good. If it's solid aluminum, just be sure that it's not, it's painted or something, because light reflecting off a bare aluminum will roast your plants. And that's a short answer.
Great. Thank you. And I see in the resources that you've provided, where we've got the links on the website, there's many choices that are there.
Yeah.
What do you think of water conservation, such as hydroretain? All right. Well, let's go on.
If you spell it, is it in the chat?
Yeah, it's at the top. HYD retain. Hydroretain.
Let me go to the top.
Water conservation.
I don't know about
713.
Good native. I don't know.
Okay.
Hydrotain. I do think that water conservation is very important. And what I know is that, just to reinforce a little bit, if you choose your plants carefully and plant them close together, you totally can use mulch at first because they're going to be little, but let them get big and let them cover the whole ground. And you might want to use a little bit of drip irrigation or soaker hose at first, but the more mature a garden like that gets, it's even going to have a lot of resilience in periods of drought.
Right. Great. Rabbits. Our specialists seem to savor my native plants. How do you recommend dressing?
Yes. Oh, what a problem. And we have a place on the Cape, and rabbits are a terrible problem. We don't have them so much in our yard here in Sharon because we have a dog and 2 cats. So if you can't get a pet, and I have to preface this by saying that, if any wild animal is hungry enough, it's going to eat almost anything, except things that are really poisonous. But you can really discourage rabbits by planting at the sort of surrounding your garden or at the edge of your garden, the space between the grass and the back 40 of your garden, plants that are fuzzy or have very strong herbal kind of taste. Let's see, I think I have a little list here of actually some plants that will work. You can use agastaki, anise hyssop, which is pretty tall, but it has a yucky taste. Yarrow, bee balm, mountain mint, salvias, ageratums, ferns. I haven't experienced rabbits eating ferns. If anyone has, I'd love to hear about it. Milkweeds, that they just taste horrible to wildlife. Ginger, Amsonia or blue star, bugbanes and armerias, the coastal pincushion plant, and create a good barrier of those, or you could just use those only in your garden. Right. And the other thing I've done is created a really nice wooden fence around the garden. It can be either post and rail, or in some cases we've done like an arts and crafts design, a design that's that picks up other details on the house itself. And so you have the fence there, but you back it with landscape fabric, which is the name for actually the wire mesh, with a very small hole, like a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch hole, and bury that down into the ground. And when you're looking at that garden, what you see is the beautiful wooden fence. You really don't see the wire mesh behind it, which is what's keeping the rabbits out.
Great idea. There were a couple questions about shaded areas, natives that are great for shade, and then any chance of any pollinator friendly items in the shade garden.
Oh, there's lots. So the bug bane that I was talking about before, it used to be called Simisafuga or Fuga. A lot of these plants change Latin names every few years, but it's the bug banes, or the cohoshes, goat's beard. Let's see. Oh gosh, not hosta. That's not native, but the heucheras, the tiarellas. These are all native, beautiful native shady ground covers that have a white bushy flower. They can bloom all through the season, and the heucheras, are the coral bells. And then I myself have actually started in my foundation planting at my house. I'm planting Canada Mayflower, some of the real New England forest ground covers, starflower, a bunch of things that you really usually only see in the woods. Well, I'm going to try to make that woodland ground cover planting as my foundation planting. I've got ferns in there, a whole bunch of stuff like that. Ferns are probably not pollinator supportive plants as far as I know, but they are habitat plants. So
Great, lots to choose from. Um, Cynthia asks, and I'm going to guess with all this information and seeing all the beautiful gardens, how would you recommend someone just get started?
oh, well, almost anywhere is, if you're going to start, that is a wonderful thing. And, everyone needs a recognizable handle to grab when they're starting with anything. So what interests you the most? Is it photography? Is it reading plant encyclopedias? Is it learning about butterflies, learning about birds? Maybe you're a birder. So grab a handle that interests you and start that way, and look on the internet, look at books, and start to learn about that thing that really excites you about nature and about your garden, because that way this is never going to be a task for you. This is going to always be a delight.
Great. Should I pull out my established butterfly bush?
Yes, I'm sorry. People cry when I tell them about butterfly bush. And I think that before you do that, maybe see if you can fall in love with some other pollinator supportive, butterfly supportive plants and get those into your garden. And when you do pull it out, you want to pull it out before it sets seed, because it's very invasive. And leave it like in a garbage bag or one of those brown paper lawn clippings bags. Those are even better than a plastic garbage bag, because they will, when they go into your into the whoever picks up your garbage, they are going to decompose. And make sure it's dead before you throw it away.
Got it.
Sorry.
I think you covered, but can you repeat what would be some good replacements for the butterfly bush that you just ripped out?
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, there are so many. So clethra is a wonderful one. It's actually known by a bunch of different names. Summer sweet. Let's see. Is Calicarpa the right Latin name for Carolina spice bush? That's a wonderful one. Blueberries. Put in some blueberries. If you want the color of a butterfly bush, you could look into some of the native roses. You're going to be pretty pink there, but they're spectacular. You might want to try some cardinal flower, some of the taller perennials that will, bloom in patches through the summer. Let's see. If you look on the plant lists that are going to be available, you will find some good flowering substitutes for that.
Great. Should I cut back my garden in the early spring to promote new growth?
Okay, so that's a good question. Assuming that you've left it, you've left all the plant material all winter long, at some point when you see green growth coming up, I think you're excused for cutting the stems down and all that sort of thing. And I actually happen to be close to a lot of oak trees, and so I get a lot of oak leaves falling into my garden in the fall. And most years I actually leave those because they decompose very quickly in the summer and they do become a sort of a mulch. But often I will take down the stems once I'm sure spring is coming. But I don't put those stems in the garbage or for leaf collection. I will either bundle them as that image showed, or I will, if you're lucky enough to have a patch of woodland, you can just start a brush pile and just lay them gently there. And if there are, baby insects in there somewhere, they will survive.
Right, great. Let's see, I could address a couple of questions that came by. What are some ways to acquire native plants to grow in my garden? I want to make folks aware of on Facebook, there's the Wellesley Perennial Share group, where people put up plants that they're perennials that they're splitting, or you can do in search of as well. Is a great resource. And also on Facebook, the Wellesley Sustainable Living Group gets posts about when Mass Hort has native plant sales. Thank you, Lise, for putting up the Native Plant Trust Garden in the Woods has plant sales going on, and Sustainable Wellesley is selling some of the plants from there as well. And then in the materials, as you said, in the links and the documents that are in the links, there are some nurseries as well that you have also listed in there.
Yes.
Let's take one more question. Let's see. We have kids who hide in plants. Are there ways to deter ticks?
Well, I think so. Having I have animals, as I said, and so doing tick checks is, I think, the best way. Really, ticks are part of our natural environment. Opossums eat them. I don't know of a non-poisonous way or a non-detrimental way to really avoid ticks. I know that deer are sometimes hunted because they're a host to the Lyme disease tick. but even that is not going to get rid of ticks. And I really think the best thing you can do is have your kids wear socks, and tuck their pants into their socks, long sleeves if possible. And then just, try to do a tick check in the bath or the shower when they come in. It's one of those hazards of really being outside in New England in 2021 right now, I'm sorry to say.
Right.
I garden all organically myself, and I have not found any more ticks than anywhere else in my garden. So I don't think that gardening with natives or gardening organically attracts ticks at all, any more than any other outdoor space.
Right. And Joy wanted to remind us also turkeys, if you have them in your yard, they eat ticks. Amanda, this was awesome. Thank you so much. So much information in here, in everything you went through, and so beautiful to look at. We will be having a recording of this posted to the website, the same links I've provided already, and we'll be emailing out. Thank you, Judy Barr from the Wellesley Conservation Land Trust, and our partners at the Wellesley Natural Resources Commission and Sustainable Wellesley and Wellesley Free Library for helping publicize this. You'll find all the previous recordings. Cricket Glass was very popular and very informative earlier this year as well on the website, and the YouTube recording of that. Lots of links on our website, the More menu, resources, native plant, and pollinator resources. And so thank you again, Amanda. We will see everyone back here at the same time next Thursday night at the same Zoom link. Follow us on Facebook as well to keep up to date with all the goings on. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.